The water came for Indiana in the middle of the night, and by the time the sun rose over the flattened cornfields and swollen rivers of the American Midwest, 7 people were already dead. This is the story of how a state known for its quiet farmland and small-town normalcy became the site of one of the most devastating flooding disasters in over a century, a disaster that would submerge entire neighborhoods, cut power to nearly 300,000 homes at its peak, and force a sitting president to approve emergency federal aid within days. It began, as so many American disasters now begin, with a forecast that nobody took seriously enough. Meteorologists had been watching a slow-moving band of storms drift across the Ohio Valley since the early days of August, but nothing in the initial models suggested the kind of catastrophic, record-breaking rainfall that was about to fall on central Indiana. Then, starting on Tuesday, August the 11th, the sky simply refused to stop opening. Over the following days, some parts of the state recorded more than 11 inches of rain in a 48-hour window, an amount that would overwhelm even the most modern flood defenses, let alone the aging infrastructure of towns that had not seen water like this in over 100 years. By Friday, the White River, the waterway that winds directly through the heart of Indianapolis and up through towns like Anderson and Noblesville, had begun to rise at a pace that stunned even veterans, hydrologists. In Anderson and Noblesville, the river crested at more than 24 feet, a number that on its own means very little to most people until you understand what it displaced. That crest broke a flood record that had stood since 1913, more than a century of data wiped out in a matter of hours. To put it plainly, the White River rose higher on this weekend in August than it had at any point in over 100 years of recorded American history, higher than during the Great Flood that reshaped much of the Midwest, higher than anything the current generation of Hoosiers had ever prepared for. Indianapolis Mayor Joe Hogsett would later stand in front of cameras and describe it as the worst flooding his city had experienced in more than 3 decades. And for a mayor who has weathered his share of winter storms and summer thunderstorms, that admission alone tells you everything about the scale of what unfolded. As the water rose, so did the human cost. Officials confirmed that at least 7 people lost their lives across the state as a direct result of the flooding and the storms that caused it. Among the dead was a 4-year-old boy, a detail that stops the story cold every time it is repeated, because behind every statistic in a disaster report is a family that will never be whole again. 3 men and 3 women also lost their lives in the days between the storms first breaking out on Tuesday and the floodwaters finally beginning to recede on Sunday. The exact circumstances of each death varied, swept away in vehicles that attempted to cross flooded roads, caught in rising water inside homes that filled faster than anyone expected, or lost in the chaos of a landscape that had, almost overnight, become unrecognizable. Emergency officials have repeated the same warning that gets issued after every flood disaster in America, and yet somehow never quite sinks in until it is too late. Turn around, don't drown, because it takes shockingly little moving water to sweep a car off a roadway or knock a grown adult off their feet. While the deaths dominate the headlines, the scale of displacement and disruption across Indiana this past week has been staggering in its own right. Nearly 130,000 utility customers across the state remained without power as floodwaters were still receding on Sunday afternoon, a number that itself represented a dramatic improvement from the peak of the crisis, when outages affected roughly 300,000 customers at once. Picture that for a moment, 300,000 households, meaning potentially close to 1 million individual Hoosiers sitting in the dark during the height of a flood emergency, unable to charge phones to call for help, unable to run sump pumps that might have saved their basements, unable to see the water creeping toward their front doors except by flashlight or the dim glow of a phone battery draining fast. Utility crews worked around the clock through waterlogged neighborhoods, downed power lines draped across flooded streets, transformers blown by the surge, substations partially submerged, all of it slowing the restoration effort in ways that compounded the misery for families already displaced from their homes. Governor Mike Braun's office reported that more than 350 evacuations took place across the state, alongside what officials described as scores of additional rescue and welfare checks in communities far beyond the immediate Indianapolis metro area. One of the most alarming incidents took place at a senior mobile home community north of Indianapolis, where elderly residents, many with limited mobility and few resources to evacuate quickly on their own, had to be pulled from rising water by emergency crews working against the clock. Mobile home communities are almost always among the hardest hit in flood disasters like this one, not because the people who live in them did anything wrong, but because these homes sit lower to the ground, offer less structural resistance to floodwater, and are disproportionately home to older residents, fixed-income families, and people without the means to simply pick up and leave at a moment's notice. When you hear about a senior mobile home community being evacuated in the middle of a flood emergency, You are hearing about some of the most vulnerable people in the entire state, facing the worst of what nature can deliver, and about first responders risking their own safety in fast-moving water to make sure nobody was left behind. Indianapolis itself absorbed some of the most visible damage from the flooding, but it was far from the only place suffering. Yorktown, a smaller community caught in the path of the surging waters, saw its public library severely impacted, with footage circulating online showing roughly a foot of standing water throughout the building. In a post shared by the library afterward, staff described the moment of seeing their building underwater as heartbreaking. A small but telling window into how a disaster like this touches not just homes, but the institutions communities rely on, the shared spaces where children go for story time, where job seekers print resumes, where the elderly come in from the heat. The library would later report that the water had receded and that a mitigation company had been brought in to begin the recovery process. But for a small-town library, the road back to normal after a flood like this can stretch on for months, sometimes longer, as walls are stripped down to the studs, carpets torn out, books and archives assessed for what can be saved and what is simply gone. Perhaps no single story captures the personal toll of this disaster better than that of Frank Gounder, a furniture maker living on Indianapolis's hard-hit north side, less than a mile from the White River itself. Sunday, the day floodwaters finally began receding across much of the region, happened to be his 37th birthday, a coincidence that carries its own quiet cruelty. Gounder had stayed in his home as the water crept steadily up his driveway, watching, helplessly as it climbed higher and higher until it reached roughly 2 feet deep inside both his house and the workshop where he builds his handmade furniture. For someone whose livelihood depends on carefully crafted, painstakingly built pieces of wood furniture, 2 feet of floodwater inside a workshop is not a minor inconvenience. It is a direct hit to years of accumulated inventory, tools, materials, and the physical space where his income is generated. On what should have been a day of celebration, Gounder instead found himself picking through waterlogged materials and half-finished furniture pieces, trying to determine what, if anything, could still be salvaged from the wreckage. He described the scope of the loss simply as a lot, 4 words that somehow managed to convey both the enormity of the moment and the exhaustion of someone who has run out of more elaborate language to describe what he is feeling. Stories like Gounder's were repeating themselves across dozens of neighborhoods throughout the flood zone this past week. Families returning to homes that had taken on water, sorting through ruined furniture, waterlogged photo albums, appliances that would never work again, carpet that had to be torn out before mold set in. In disaster response circles, this phase is sometimes referred to almost clinically as the muck-out period. The days immediately after floodwaters recede, when residents and volunteers move through homes, stripping out anything the water touched. Because in the docile Midwest humidity of an Indiana August, mold can begin forming within 24 to 48 hours of a flood, turning what started as a water disaster into a long-term health hazard if it isn't addressed immediately. For families without flood insurance, and it is worth noting that the vast majority of American homeowners do not carry flood insurance because their properties technically sit outside federally designated flood zones, this kind of damage can represent a financial catastrophe layered directly on top of an emotional one. The scale of infrastructure damage across the state has also been severe. Roads and bridges throughout the affected region were seriously damaged, or in some cases washed out entirely by the rushing water, cutting off access between communities and complicating both rescue efforts and the initial wave of recovery work. When a bridge is washed out in rural or semi-rural Indiana, it is rarely a simple fix. These structures often serve as the only direct route between small towns, meaning a washed-out bridge can add an hour or more to what used to be a 10-minute drive, disrupting everything from grocery deliveries to school bus routes to emergency medical response times in the weeks following the initial disaster. Transportation officials have begun the process of assessing every damaged roadway and bridge across the flood zone, a process that, in past disasters of similar scale, has taken months to fully catalog, let alone repair. Recognizing the scale of what his state was facing, Governor Braun moved quickly to request federal assistance, reaching out directly to President Trump to formally request a presidential emergency declaration. On Saturday, that request was approved, unlocking up to $5 million in federal resources to support the ongoing response and recovery effort across Indiana. While $5 million may sound like a significant sum, disaster recovery experts are quick to point out that in flooding events of this scale, involving hundreds of evacuations, thousands of damaged structures, and infrastructure repairs stretching across multiple counties, an emergency declaration of this size is typically just the opening chapter of a much longer federal involvement, often followed by additional funding requests as damage assessments are completed and the true scope of the destruction becomes clear. Emergency management officials at both the state and federal level have indicated that further assistance requests are likely as assessment teams continue moving through the hardest hit counties in the coming weeks. The response from Indiana's professional sports community added an unexpected but meaningful thread to this story. The NFL's Indianapolis Colts and the NBA's Indiana Pacers each announced donations of $125,000 to flood relief efforts across the state, with the money directed to the American Red Cross to support its ongoing operations. The WNBA's Indiana Fever and the Noblesville Boom, a G League basketball affiliate, joined the effort as well, adding their own contributions to a growing pool of relief funding. For a state where professional sports franchises often serve as unifying civic institutions, cutting across political and geographic divides, this kind of coordinated response sends a signal that reaches far beyond the dollar figures themselves. It tells displaced families that their state's most visible institutions are paying attention, and it often encourages a wave of smaller donations from ordinary residents who see their hometown teams stepping up. On the ground, the American Red Cross has been running around-the-clock operations to support displaced families. Terry Stigdon, who leads the Red Cross's Indiana region, reported that the organization served roughly 200 people on a single Saturday night alone, providing emergency shelter, food, and basic supplies to families who had nowhere else to turn. Across the broader relief effort, more than 4,700 meals and snacks have been distributed to flood victims in the days since the disaster began, a number that continues to climb as more shelters open and more volunteers arrive to help staff them. Behind every meal served is a family sleeping on a cot in a school gymnasium or community center because their own home is currently uninhabitable, their basement full of water, their electrical systems potentially compromised, their walls beginning to show the telltale water lines that mark exactly how high the flood reached inside their own living room. Meteorologically, this disaster fits into a broader and increasingly familiar pattern that climate scientists have been tracking across the American Midwest and much of the eastern United States in recent years, an atmosphere capable of holding more moisture than it once could, translating into rainfall events that arrive less frequently but with dramatically higher intensity when they do occur. The 11 inches of rain that fell over Indiana in a 48-hour period is not simply an unlucky roll of the weather dice. It fits a pattern of what meteorologists increasingly refer to as training storms, systems that essentially stall or repeatedly track over the same geographic area, dumping rain after rain onto ground that has already reached saturation, with nowhere left for the water to go except into rivers, streets, basements, and eventually into people's homes. The White River's climb to a level not seen in over a century is a stark illustration of what happens when infrastructure designed around historical rainfall data collides with a present-day climate capable of exceeding those historical benchmarks. As northern parts of Indiana slowly began drying out over the weekend, officials warned that the danger was not yet fully over. A fresh cluster of storms was tracking toward the central and southern portions of the state, even as recovery efforts were underway further north, carrying with it the renewed potential for heavy rain, flash flooding, and damaging winds. The National Weather Service issued warnings urging residents in these areas to remain alert, a reminder that in a disaster of this scale, recovery and continued risk often unfold simultaneously, rather than in the neat, sequential order that news coverage sometimes implies. For families in southern Indiana who had been watching the disaster unfold to their north with a degree of relief that it hadn't reached them yet, that relief came with an asterisk, because the same atmospheric conditions that soaked Anderson and Noblesville and Indianapolis were far from finished with the state as a whole. What makes this disaster particularly striking to outside observers is not just the raw numbers, though. 7 deaths, 130,000 power outages, and a flood record broken after more than 100 years are all individually significant. It is the fact that Indiana is not a state typically associated with catastrophic flooding on this scale. Unlike coastal states that build hurricane preparedness into their civic identity, or areas of the Deep South accustomed to seasonal river flooding, much of Indiana's flood infrastructure and public awareness has historically been built around a much lower baseline of risk. That is precisely what makes events like this one so dangerous. Communities that have not internalized the possibility of a 100-year flood are often the least prepared when one actually arrives, both in terms of physical infrastructure like levees and drainage systems, and in terms of public behavior, how quickly people evacuate, how seriously they take flood warnings. Whether they attempt to drive through water, they should never attempt to cross. The recovery ahead for Indiana will almost certainly stretch on for months, even as the floodwaters themselves continue to recede over the coming days. Damage assessment teams will need to move systematically through affected counties, cataloging everything from residential water damage to agricultural losses, in a state where farmland surrounds nearly every town touched by this disaster. Indiana's economy remains deeply tied to agriculture, and floodwaters arriving in mid-August, right in the heart of the growing season for corn and soybeans, raise serious questions about crop losses that will not be fully understood until harvest season arrives in the fall. Farmers across the flood zone are likely facing their own quiet catastrophe, fields submerged at precisely the wrong moment in the growing cycle, a loss that will not make headlines the way a submerged library or a flooded furniture workshop does, but one that will ripple through rural communities and local economies for a full growing season to come. For displaced families, the coming weeks will bring a familiar and exhausting sequence of steps: filing insurance claims for those who have coverage, applying for federal disaster assistance for those who qualify, coordinating with contractors already stretched thin by the sheer volume of flood-damaged properties needing repair, and in many cases, making the difficult decision of whether to rebuild in the same location or relocate somewhere the risk of this happening again feels less immediate. Emergency management officials have not yet released a comprehensive dollar figure for total damages across the state, a number that, in disasters of this scale, typically takes weeks, if not months, to fully calculate as assessment teams work through both residential and infrastructure damage county by county. As of this recording, power crews continue working to restore electricity to the roughly 130,000 customers still affected. River levels across the state continue their slow retreat back toward normal, and officials continue urging caution as a new round of storms moves through the central and southern regions. The full scope of what Indiana has lost this week, in lives, in homes, and farmland, and the quiet sense of security that comes from believing your town has never flooded like this before, and never will, is still being written. What is already clear is that the White River's rise past a flood mark set in 1913 will not be forgotten quickly by the people who watched the water climb their driveways, fill their basements, and in the most devastating cases, take the lives of their neighbors. Indiana will rebuild, as it has after every disaster before this one. But for the families who lost someone this past week, for Frank Gounder standing in his flooded workshop on his 37th birthday, for the residents of that senior mobile home community pulled from rising water, and for the librarians in Yorktown scrubbing floodwater out of a building meant to serve their entire town, the memory of this August will not fade with the receding river. It will remain, the way every 100-year flood remains, as the new marker against which every future storm in this part of the Midwest will quietly be measured. To understand just how unusual this event truly was, it helps to step back and look at what the record it broke actually represents. The flood of 1913, the benchmark the White River finally surpassed this past weekend, is remembered in Midwestern weather history as one of the defining natural disasters of the early 20th century. A storm system so severe that it reshaped emergency response planning across multiple states for generations afterward. For that 13-year-old benchmark to be broken, not by a narrow margin, but by more than a foot of additional height, tells meteorologists and civil engineers something important, that the assumptions baked into more than 100 years of flood planning, the height of the levees, the capacity of the drainage systems, the elevation requirements for new construction near the river, may no longer reflect the reality of what this waterway is now capable of producing. Engineers who study river systems for a living describe events like this as recalibration moments, points at which an entire region is forced to quietly rewrite its understanding of worst-case scenarios, because the old worst case has just been surpassed in real time in front of everyone. The human response to a disaster of this scale rarely stays confined to official channels alone, and Indiana this past week has been no exception. Alongside the American Red Cross and state emergency crews, an enormous informal network of neighbors, church groups, local businesses, and volunteer organizations mobilized within hours of the first major flooding reports. Boats normally used for weekend fishing trips on the state's lakes were pressed into service, pulling stranded families from rooftops and second-story windows. Local restaurants that still had power in the early days of the crisis began cooking and distributing free meals to displaced residents and exhausted first responders alike. Church basements and community centers that, under normal circumstances, host potlucks and youth group meetings were converted almost overnight into makeshift shelters, stocked with cots, blankets, and diapers for the youngest evacuees. This is a pattern familiar to anyone who has covered American disaster response before, the official infrastructure of FEMA declarations, and Red Cross shelters moving in parallel with a grassroots wave of ordinary residents refusing to wait for permission to start helping their neighbors. The psychological toll of an event like this is often the least visible part of the story, and also one of the longest lasting. Disaster. Mental health specialists who have studied flood survivors in previous events note that the trauma of watching water rise inside your own home tends to linger in ways that are different from other kinds of disaster loss. Unlike a tornado, which strikes and passes in minutes, a flood unfolds slowly enough that survivors often describe a specific and haunting memory standing in their living room, watching the waterline creep up the wall inch by inch, unable to do anything to stop it, forced simply to watch as the water claims one possession after another. That helplessness, the sense of watching disaster happen in slow motion rather than being struck by it suddenly, is something survivors frequently carry with them long after the physical cleanup is finished. Children in flood-affected households are considered particularly vulnerable to this kind of prolonged stress, and school counselors across the affected districts have already begun preparing programs to support students whose families lost homes, vehicles, or in some tragic cases, loved ones during the flooding. Utility restoration crews, meanwhile, have been engaged in a painstaking and genuinely dangerous process across the affected region. Restoring power after a flood of this magnitude is never as simple as flipping a switch once the water recedes. Every substation that took on water has to be fully inspected before it can be safely re-energized, because sending electricity through equipment that has been submerged risks fires, explosions, or further damage to an already strained grid. Downed lines have to be located and repaired one at a time, often in neighborhoods where the streets themselves are still impassable due to debris, washed-out pavement, or standing water. Crews from neighboring states have reportedly been called in to assist Indiana's own utility workers, a mutual aid arrangement common in disasters of this scale, where linemen from unaffected regions travel hundreds of miles to help restore power to communities they have never visited, working 16-hour shifts in the August heat to bring light and refrigeration back to families who have been without it for days. For households relying on medical equipment, oxygen concentrators, refrigerated insulin-powered wheelchairs, every additional day without electricity represents not just an inconvenience, but a genuine health risk, which is part of why utility companies have prioritized restoration efforts around hospitals, nursing homes, and addresses flagged for medical necessity. There is also a quieter, longer economic story unfolding beneath the immediate headlines of deaths and outages. Small businesses across the flood zone, many of them family-owned operations that have served their communities for decades, are now facing the same brutal calculus that confronts homeowners without flood insurance. A flooded restaurant kitchen, a soaked retail inventory, a small manufacturing shop with water-damaged equipment. These are the kinds of losses that do not always make it into national disaster coverage, but that determine whether a downtown block recovers within a year or sits partially vacant for the next 5. Local chambers of commerce across the affected counties have already begun compiling lists of businesses seeking emergency assistance, aware that for every large employer with the resources to absorb a temporary closure, there are a dozen smaller operations for whom 2 weeks without revenue could mean the difference between reopening and closing permanently. Indiana's story this week also fits into an uncomfortable but increasingly familiar national pattern: disaster events that used to be described, using the language of rarity, the 100-year flood, the storm of the century, arriving with a frequency that makes those descriptions feel almost quaint. Emergency management professionals across the country have begun quietly retiring some of that older terminology altogether, noting that when multiple states experience their own 100-year or 500-year flooding events within the same handful of years, the statistical framework underlying those labels starts to lose its usefulness as a planning tool. Whatever the precise cause, and the broader climate conversation remains the subject of ongoing scientific and political debate. The practical reality on the ground in Indiana this week has been unmistakable. A river that broke a century-old record, a death toll that continues to be confirmed county by county, and a state government now forced to plan not just for recovery from this event, but for the possibility that another one like it could arrive again far sooner than the history books would have suggested. As days turn into weeks, the attention of the national media will inevitably drift elsewhere, toward the next headline, the next emergency, the next disaster demanding coverage somewhere else in the country. But for the residents of Anderson, Noblesville, Indianapolis, Yorktown, and the dozens of smaller communities caught in the path of the White River's historic rise, the work of rebuilding will continue long after the news trucks have packed up and left. Insurance adjusters will keep walking through gutted homes with clipboards, contractors will keep booking out months in advance, and families will keep making the quiet, painful decisions that come after a disaster like this: what to repair, what to replace, and what simply cannot be saved. The story of the Indiana flood crisis of August 2026 will ultimately be written not in the initial wave of headlines about death tolls and power outages, but in the months and years of recovery that follow, in the libraries rebuilt, the workshops restocked, the bridges repaired, and the quiet, hard-won return to something resembling normal life for a state that, for one devastating week in August, watched its rivers rise higher than they had in more than 100 years.